Welcome to Convocation. We're glad that you're here. Today, we are pleased to have Annie Brewer as our Convocation speaker. Annie is co-founder of Educational Opportunities for Utah's Children, or Opps, and the Udream Scholarship Fund. She also co-authored Dreamers, Living in the Shadow of Hope, which is a photodocumentary depiction of young, undocumented immigrants living in Utah. She earned her MSW from the University of Utah and worked for over 30 years in the Salt Lake City School District, helping at-risk students complete high school and engage in post-secondary education. She currently serves on the Opps Board of Directors. She also told me she is a happily retired grandmother. Please welcome to the stage, Annie Brewer.
Excuse me while I get logged in here. Okay, thank you very much for being here and for having this opportunity to speak with you. I've been asked to talk a little bit about Dreamers and the nonprofit that I work with. Cheryl mentioned Educational Opportunities for Utah's Children, which is way too long, so we call it Opps. And I'm not familiar with the audience and what you know about Dreamers, so I think we need to start with what is a dreamer, who are the dreamers, and we need to go back about 20 years. Basically, dreamers are immigrants who arrived in the U.S. as children without legal documents or with short-term visas, but they don't have permission to reside here. And this nickname came from the Development, Relief, and Education for Alien Minors Act, the DREAM Act, which was a piece of proposed legislation initially introduced in the U.S. Senate in 2001, so about 21 years ago. And actually, Orrin Hatch, who was a senator from Utah, was one of the co-sponsors. Dick Durbin from Illinois was the other. And this piece of legislation applied to people who arrived in the U.S. before the age of 16. They have resided in the U.S. for at least 5 consecutive years. They're between the ages of 12 and 35 at the time of bill enactment. They've graduated from American high school or received a GED, and they are of good moral character. If implemented, the legislation would provide a temporary protection status to these students, these people, which would allow the dreamers to be in the U.S. without being deported, to work, and to apply for residency after a probationary period of about 5 or 6 years. So, what happened to the DREAM Act? Since 2001, the original DREAM Act has been reintroduced to Congress 9 times. Similar bills which focused on some type of aid or relief for childhood arrivals have been introduced 23 times. Currently, there are 2 versions, one in the Senate, one in the House, the Dream and Promise Act, that are before Congress. And over these past 20 years, very often one version of the bill has passed in the Senate, but not in the House, passed in the House, but not in the Senate, attached to other items of legislation that did not pass. So it's been kicked around for quite a while. Right now, between 2 and 3 million dreamers would qualify for conditional permanent status under this legislation, and approximately 1 million more could apply if they would enroll in school. In last June of 2021, surveys found that 72% of American voters would support the DREAM Act. 63% wanted to include citizenship options or some kind of package for other types of immigrants. And we won't go into all those details, but it appears that most of the American population would support this DREAM Act and these opportunities for young people who came here through no choice of their own. One more thing that happened in 2002 was that the Utah State Legislature passed House Bill 144, which gave Dreamer students, basically with those same qualifications, the opportunity to attend college or university in Utah and have the non-resident portion of tuition waived. So they could attend college or university at the resident fee schedule, which is usually about a third of what a non-resident has to pay. A student could qualify for that waiver if they attended a Utah high school for 3 or more years, they graduated or will graduate from a Utah high school, or attained the equivalent of a GED in Utah. They've not registered for college classes prior to fall 2002. They don't hold a current visa, for instance, a student visa. And they have filed or will file, sorry, is this on? Okay. An application to legalize their immigration as soon as they can do that. So 2001, 2002, fast forward to 2008. I was working at Horizonte, which is an alternative school in the Salt Lake City School District. And I met this student named Joaquin. He had moved to Utah from California and had missed some high school credits in the move. So he finished with his GED here in Utah and placed 96th percent in the nation, which is a very high score. Joaquin was very bright, very hardworking, and he wanted to go to college. And as we talked about his options, his story unfolded. He said he came to the U.S. when he was 2. Excuse me, his dad came for work, and he grew up in California. And as his dad worked with the same company for a good dozen years or so and had progressed to a regional manager and was in the process of applying for residency when he was diagnosed with cancer and passed away within 6 months. So his dad died when Joaquin was 12. Mom returned to Mexico to bury her husband and was not able to come back. So Joaquin, whose girlfriend had moved to Utah and was pregnant, came here to support the family. So Joaquin, I believe, was 17 when he moved to Utah. He finished out his senior year, but had to do the GED to finish his diploma. So he was at kind of this odd spot, and this is really the first time I became aware of what it meant to be a dreamer. In the United States, I was not very familiar with the legislations that had been passed or anything, but as I got to know Joaquin and saw his incredible willingness to work, for one thing. He was very bright, and he wanted to be able to support his family. So I became interested in this issue. I started talking to other students in our school. This is Rosa, a young mother in our high school at the time. Her dad came to the U.S. on a work visa and saved enough money to bring the rest of the family over when she was 2. Excuse me. He became abusive, and the parents split up here in Utah and left the mom to support the family. At age 16, Rosa had a daughter with a young man who was a U.S. citizen. As a high school senior, Rosa wanted to go to college, If she married her boyfriend, she could probably apply for citizenship, but she didn't want to marry just for that reason. Her daughter was a U.S. citizen because she was born here, but Rosa was very concerned about how she would be able to proceed in either a career or college without her citizenship. Another student that I talked with, Nere, she came to the U.S. at 3 months old after her uncle had been murdered in his hometown in Mexico, and threats were made to the extended family. Her dad got permission to work and moved to Utah and brought the family. Years later, about 10 years after that, when he was on a construction job in Texas, there was a raid at the work site, and he was presumed undocumented because he didn't have all his papers with him, and he was deported back to Mexico. By the time he got his paperwork and proof of his residency, the family had been without income here in Utah for many months. They'd lost their home, they lost their car, and when he returned, they basically had to start all over. Nere loves to write and was hoping that she could go to college. Another student at our school, Luis, came to this country as an infant. He has no memory of his native homeland. He did well in school. He wants to play professional soccer. And when we talked, he was the youth representative on the Salt Lake City Board of Education that year and was about to graduate. He felt very uncertain about his future, but he kept his status quiet. He said, I've told a couple friends I was undocumented, but none of them believed me anyway. So he didn't talk about it, and he didn't know what to do. He didn't know what options were available. He did odd jobs for people, yard work and so forth, where he was paid in cash, but wasn't sure he could go to college. So in 2008, our country was experiencing a major economic downturn, a recession basically, and the anti-immigrant rhetoric was very loud and very negative in the media. These are the pictures you would often see referring to immigrants, and especially illegal immigrants. Immigrants are illegal, close the borders, they destroy living wages, it's a crime, on and on and on. And I couldn't really reconcile these images that I was seeing in the media and the public opinion that was developing with the stories of these students I had come to know, and with their hardworking families that had to work 2 or 3 jobs just to keep food on the table. So it was very discomforting to me. Along with the bad news that was in the media all the time, there were some very common myths going around about undocumented immigrants. And when I went to do some fact-checking, is what we call it now, these are the myths that came out most often. First of all, that they're criminals. They're all criminals. But in fact, coming across the border illegally is a civil offense, not a criminal offense. And U.S. residents are about 4 times more likely to be incarcerated for a crime than immigrants. Second, they won't take their turn. They won't wait to come here legally and follow the rules. And as I looked into that, it was very difficult to gain admission to the United States. We gave out very few work permits every year, but there was a large need for workers. And the average wait time back in 2008, 2009 was about 10 years to get permission to come in legally. People said they don't pay taxes, but they do pay taxes, millions and millions of dollars in taxes. They take away jobs from U.S. workers. No, they usually take away jobs from other immigrants. Most, especially undocumented immigrants, enter at the very bottom rung of the job ladder. So they may be competing with other immigrants, but not usually with U.S. workers. They come here just to get the benefits, which is also not true. They can't apply for welfare, they can't apply for Social Security, even though they pay into it in their jobs. They don't have public benefits easily available to them. People say they don't want to learn English. And actually about 66% or so of immigrants learn to speak English well or very well within the first 5 years after their arrival. And then people said, well, you know, the immigration system should be fixed with either state laws, or we need to enforce more harshly the federal laws. In fact, every state has different nuanced immigration laws. It's very confusing. So I just became very frustrated. I thought, what can I do about this? I'm not a politician. That's not my thing. I was a social worker. But how could I present the truth about these young people, about who they were, what they wanted, how they got here, why they came here, without compromising their identity? At the time, it was very scary to reveal that you were undocumented. You always faced the risk of deportation. So I reached out to a photographer that I knew and asked if he'd be interested in doing some kind of photodocumentary about the lives of these young people. And he was tied up in some other projects, but he introduced me to a woman named Lynn Hoffman-Browse. And Lynn he'd been her mentor. She was a Salt Lake City-based photographer and had worked for several nonprofit institutions or organizations. She was a very good photographer, and we met just sight unseen, and I described what I was interested in doing. And she said, yes, let's do it. We didn't have any money. We didn't have anything. I really went about this project backwards. I thought, we'll just apply for a grant and get a grant or whatever, but it never happened. So we began. We began with students that I knew in the high schools. And this took a lot of courage for these students to be willing to participate. And we would take their pictures. Lynn would take several shots of them, and then she would let them choose which photograph they wanted to use in the exhibit. So most of them, as you can see, have disguised at least all or part of their face. And then after they chose their photo, we would ask them to just handwrite a response to the photo that they chose. And I'll just read you this. It would be hard to read on the screen. Dina says, I was only 9 years old when that cold, hard truth hit me. Initially, I was angry at my mother for not taking on the task of childbearing on this side of the borderline. Or she could have just left us where we belonged. Being 9 years old with a light complexion and no accent, I could have easily passed for an American girl. Even though I was that young, I was always an insightful child. I knew we had to leave our native country because of the abuse my younger sister and I witnessed as babies. Our mother was beaten repeatedly by our father. I think to this day, it has affected us in some unknown way. This was the response that she chose, to her picture. Some of the others were just a sentence. Why should my life be determined by a number, referring to a Social Security number? That's the one thing these students didn't have that prohibited them from applying for scholarships and work. All I want to do is go to college and study something that has to do with the law, but I can't because I wasn't born here. There's something wrong with that. My choices have been taken away even before I knew I had choices to make. It's not fair. You see me, but you don't see me. I could be your best friend or your neighbor. I could be that person who walked by you today. People have this idea of who I am, but do you know who I am? You see me, but you don't see me. As I fall away into the shadow of uncertainty. So this project eventually included 35 young people in high school or college. Some of our high school friends introduced us to their siblings or people they knew that were in college at the time. And again, because of that 2002 Utah Dream Act, at that point, students could go to college on HB 144. Most of them chose not to use their faces or their real names. After we photographed them, I interviewed them and recorded a life story for each one of them. And then we typed up kind of a one-page summary that was included in the exhibit, but not next to their picture. They were very afraid of being identified either by the name of their school or the place they lived or whatever. So it took a lot of courage for these students to participate in this exhibit, and I was very touched by them and by their courage. Okay, excuse me. Something's not moving along here. But after you listen to some of the comments and the difficulties they were facing, you might say, well, why did they even come here? Why immigrate? And when we talk about immigration in a broad sense, we have push factors and pull factors. I'm sorry, my screen is not forwarding. So what are the push factors of people that are trying to immigrate to the U.S.? Basically, poverty, war, domestic or neighborhood and criminal violence, famine, the inability to grow crops. I'm sorry, I need my tech guy. My screen is not forwarding. Let me see. So I guess we'll have to talk about these. Basically, it was hard to survive. People were pretty desperate. They didn't just come here to get a better life. They came here to survive. And as I met them and got their stories and listened to the stories of their families and their backgrounds, it was tough. They were very desperate when they came here. One of the girls that we met had grown up in Mexico. There was no employment available at the time. Dad became very abusive. He moved the family here, but then he deserted the family and left mom here to support the kids. Another girl, sorry you can't see these pictures, grew up in a very dangerous area in Mexico and was surrounded by crime and drugs and so forth. It was not a safe neighborhood to live in. Her dad came here first, got work, saved up enough money to bring the rest of the family. But she, as a young child, had to do that walk across the border through the desert, which was very dangerous. And then we can talk about what are the pull factors. Some people are pushed out of their home country. Some people are pulled to immigrate because of some attraction in the new country. And the only two students that I interviewed that I would say had a pull factor was one young man from Hong Kong who, his parents were both professionals in Hong Kong, but they had extended family living in Utah, and he used to come and visit his cousins, and he loved being here. He loved the freedoms that his cousins enjoyed and the way of living, so he eventually persuaded his parents to come over. And they did come for a time. He enrolled in public school, but his parents were very frustrated after being professional workers in China at having to work at menial labor jobs here. So when he was old enough to support himself, they went home. The other big pull factor, especially for Mexican families, is the difference between the wage, in Mexico and what a Mexican worker can earn in the US. So a Mexican worker in Mexico earns about $291 a month, working, probably a labor job. But a Mexican worker, even without papers, can come over across the border in the USA and earn $1,870 a month. So there's quite a wage gap. This is one of the borders around the world. Sorry, I'm just spinning here.
It's loading. That's why.
Okay, it was flowing right along.
Once it's done loading, it'll just jump forward to however many times you went forward.
Okay.
That's all I can do.
Okay. Well, sorry. You're going to miss some pictures here. But so immigration is kind of a complex issue. There are reasons people come here out of desperation. There are things here that people want. When an undocumented immigrant comes to the U.S., they do get free public education, and they can get emergency health care or some levels of health care. But they don't get food stamps. They don't get welfare. They don't get any other benefits here. But for people coming out of very violent and dangerous communities in Mexico or Central America, it is much safer, and they have a chance of surviving. There were only 2 out of 35 students, and I'm sorry you can't see their pictures, that allowed us to show their face. And that is because both of them had already been identified as dreamers. One had been picked up when he was working. He was using a fake social that he'd had for a number of years only to work, but it came up as a duplicate. He was about 18 or 19 at the time, had 2 daughters, was put in detention for a few months, and then at his hearing was unusually granted probation to stay and work and continue to support his daughters. Eventually, he broke some rule of his probation and he was deported. He had to leave his daughters and his wife here. He moved back to Mexico. The other is a young woman that by the time I met her had earned 2 bachelor degrees. She was already working as a consultant for a nonprofit, saving money to work on a master's degree. But her husband had been identified as an illegal immigrant. And in 2012, she was faced with the decision of having to either go with him back to Mexico or stay here without him. So both of the students ended up back in Mexico. So an important thing happened in 2012. Under President Obama, the Homeland Security announced that certain people, basically dreamers, that came to the United States as children and met certain guidelines could request consideration of deferred action, which means the action to deport them would be deferred for a period of 2 years, and then they would have to renew that every 2 years. They would also be eligible. I don't know what happened here. I'll let him work on this for a minute. So this came to be known as Daca, Deferred Action for Childhood Arrivals. And this was huge. People that qualified for this, the Dreamers, could work legally. They were issued something in place of a Social Security number, but it meant they could work, and they were not in danger of being deported at any moment. It didn't provide long-term lawful status, and it had to be renewed every 2 years. But this was huge for these Dreamers that had been literally living in shadows for years. So also at that time, sure. Sorry. Lynn and I had been hauling around our photo documentary exhibit for a couple of years. We had, 35 big photos to display in a school or public building, and then we'd have to take it all down. So we decided it would be much easier to just publish a book that contained the whole exhibit. So we went ahead and self-published that and started a nonprofit so that we could accept donations if people were interested. So Daca and our nonprofit came about in 2012 at the same time. And a couple of the students that we had interviewed had professors at the University of Utah that were interested in helping to start a scholarship fund for Dreamers that couldn't receive scholarships. By this time, they could not receive most scholarships that were offered at a state-funded school. Those laws kept changing. And so they approached us and asked if we would be willing to be the nonprofit and distribute the money for the scholarships, and they would help us raise the money. So that's when our nonprofit came into being. And in 2012, we were able to get a grant from the Mexican government. Oh, we'll just skip through these here. I'm sorry you missed all these. These are the 2 students that eventually had to go back to Mexico. But we started our nonprofit, and initially we wanted to help educate other educators so that they would be aware of the opportunities and the ways that undocumented students could go to school. We wanted to advocate for the students and give students information so they would know how to enroll. And then we wanted to motivate them with possible scholarships. So this small picture on the right-hand side was the first group of our Udream scholarship scholars in 2012. We were able to get money every year, we've had it for the past 10 years, from the Mexican government, which has a program to support education for its citizens living outside of Mexico, which I thought was pretty unusual and pretty amazing. But since then, we've awarded probably around 300 scholarships over the last 10 years. And this is what Daca did. So just briefly, we'll skim through what happened after these students were able to work, get scholarship money, and go to school. I've just got a few examples. This is Alonso. When we interviewed him in the black and white in 2009, he was, I believe, a junior up at the U. But every day I see, hear, face, overcome, struggle, and gives examples about that. But he said, what worries me the most is the uncertainty of my family's future. In 2016, Alonso graduated from the University of Utah with a master's in educational leadership and policy, with an emphasis in post-secondary education. And he was the first director of the Dream Center at the University of Utah, is now currently working in the diversity department at Salt Lake Community College, but giving back tremendously and encouraging other Dreamers to follow their goals of post-secondary ed. This picture is Heidi. She was the first, I believe, that we know of, first undocumented student to graduate from the S.J. Quinney College of Law at the University of Utah. In 2009, the black and white, when I interviewed her, she said, "How often I forget that I'm different. How often I have to remind myself, oh, you don't qualify for that." And later on, how often I try not to think about my circumstances, but it's not often that the world allows me to forget. And again, 7 years later, she has graduated with her JD, and then she was not allowed to take the Utah bar. So she studied for the California bar, passed that one in 2017, and then just maybe 2 or 3 years ago, they finally allowed undocumented students to take and pass the Utah bar. So she's been working in the legal profession since 2016. She got work with an international company that accepted the California bar. This is Joaquin. He is, and again, perhaps, we don't know for sure, the first undocumented student to attend the University of Utah Medical School. I believe he's now in his residency. He's still in school, but an amazing, hardworking student. This is Janet. She got her bachelor's at UVU in elementary ed. She went on to complete a master's at the University of Utah. She's been teaching 4th grade since about 2013, I believe. Just a phenomenal teacher, and has contributed so much to her community and really focuses on working with kids who are immigrants or children of immigrants. This is Litzy. Currently, she's at the University of Colorado in Pueblo. She started at SLIC and was on the soccer team there and was recruited to play for UC Pueblo. She's currently, because of COVID, in her 5th year as a senior over in Pueblo, and I believe will finish in May with 2 bachelors. Academic Player of the Year, just an excellent student and soccer player. This is Jorge, and I would love to know what happened to Jorge. He finished here in 2017. If anyone knows him, let me know what's going on with him. He finished his associates here and was interested in going on for a degree in radiology. So these are just a few examples of students that have been given the opportunity to work and to go to school. And this is what Dreamers can do. And it continues to frustrate me that even though the American public supports them, even though they've demonstrated how much they can contribute to our community, we are still legally in this, go-round in the Congress. So that's my presentation to you today, and I think we have a few minutes for questions. Is that? Sure. Thank you.
Anybody like to ask a question? Guys are so quiet. Fernando, do you know where Jorge is? Yeah, I know. Okay, here. Why don't we let Fernando fill us in
Okay.
on Jorge's story? Fernando is our Director of Diversity and Inclusion.
First of all, thank you. Thank you, Annie, for being here today. What a wonderful stories you have shown us here. Jorge is a local student. He's currently attending Weber State University. I'm assuming that he's almost done with his degree in radiology. And so I'm excited to see these students having these opportunities. And so what what a better way to support those students who otherwise don't have any options than that through the program that Annie sponsors and through anything that we can do as an institution, as the students, to look for ways to support other students who have been less fortunate than you and I have been. So I just want to mention that and thank you for the work that you have been doing and the work that you continue doing. Thank you so much. Hopefully you have some questions or comments that you want to ask.
What can us as students do to get involved to be able to help this, even though we might lack financial support, but what are some other ways that would be able to help and get involved?
Thank you. I was hoping someone would ask that. I think there are two things. One is if you support the idea of the DREAM Act, write your congressman. Push it, whenever you have the chance. I just can't believe this has been spinning for 20 years, probably longer than some of you have been alive. And these kids have been waiting. They might have been 15, 20 years ago and were hopeful, and now they're 35 with families and still waiting. So write your congressman whenever you get the chance. And I would say help to combat those myths. When you hear jokes about immigrants, when you hear negative comments about immigrants, you can be a voice for them. You may not even know them, but just in general, that negative public opinion can be changed. So you can be a voice for immigrants and help people understand dreamers did not choose to come here for the most part. Their families were desperate, and the parents sacrificed a lot to get their children here, and the parents are totally focused on giving their children more opportunities than they had. And they have to work twice as hard as most students to get even some of the same opportunities. So anytime you can help break down those barriers and the negative image that dreamers or immigrants have, that helps. So thank you. Any other questions? I did bring some pamphlets and information about our organization and about what some of the students are doing and so forth. If anyone is interested, you could come up afterwards and I could get you those.
You guys, I actually do have a question.
Okay.
You showed us DACA recipients who went to college. Can they stay for other reasons? Do they have the deferred action for other reasons as well? Can they work?
Yes.
On the tier. Okay.
Okay. The deferred action, once again, if they get deferred action, and that also has been kicked around during the Trump administration. They tried several times to throw that out, but it's still in place. Some of the courts in different states have tried to negate that. For a while, they had to apply every year, I think, but now it is in place, and it grants them temporary work permit for 2 years, if that's currently, I think it's back to a 2-year renewal, and then just a stay or they stop a deportation. So, but that was frightening when it first came out. A lot of students were very hesitant to apply because that meant the government had all of their personal information and their family's information. And even though they could apply as childhood arrivals, they had parents that couldn't apply. And so it took a lot of courage, again, for students to start applying for DACA. And as they saw their friends be approved and receive that status, it grew. And right now it's in place, but again, it's a temporary measure.
Thank you. Let's thank Annie one more time. If any of you...
Thank you.
If any of you would like to come up and speak with Annie, please do so. Otherwise, you're excused to go to your next class. For those students that I mentioned, if you would please come and talk with me.